My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 67 years old, and I'll never forget the night my son's birthday dinner turned into a scene that still stings when I think about it. We were at Lakeview Trattoria in Chicago, the place I had poured my heart and years of work into, though no one at that table knew the truth. My daughter-in-law, Samantha Reed, leaned back in her chair like a queen on her throne, looked me up and down as if I'd wandered in off the street, and with a voice dripping with disdain, she called over the waiter and told him to get security, to remove that woman from the table. That woman was me. My son Eric sat right beside her, pretending to scroll through his phone like a teenager, not even glancing my way. The humiliation ran so deep I could feel my chest tighten and my palms tremble, but I swallowed it all down, stood there with what dignity I could gather, and walked away quietly. What Samantha didn't know was that the very next morning I would sign a paper in my office that sent her from assistant manager down to the dish pit, her manicured hands gripping a sponge instead of a wine glass. It's a strange thing, how people assign worth. The way Samantha's friends at that table judged me by the wrinkles around my eyes or the fact that my blouse was a few seasons out of style. They didn't know that every glass of wine they ordered, every plate of pasta that reached the table, every paycheck for the staff who served them, all of it ran through me. I was the silent force behind that restaurant, but in that moment, I let myself look small, let them believe I was powerless. Walking out of the dining room, I could feel every pair of eyes burning into my back, whispers rising like smoke, and for a second, I nearly broke. I thought of Frank, my late husband, how he used to squeeze my hand under the table when I felt nervous at parties, and I wished more than anything he had been there to see the way his son let me be erased. But you know, shame has a way of turning into something else if you sit with it long enough. By the time I reached my little apartment that night, the anger had settled deep in my bones like a steady drumbeat. I sat at the kitchen table in the glow of that old yellow lamp, listening to the hum of the fridge, and decided that the peace I'd been protecting for years wasn't worth it anymore. I had been quiet for too long, letting Eric drift away, letting Samantha strut around my business as if she owned it, letting people mistake my silence for weakness. That night shifted something in me. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was colder, steadier, like the air just before a storm when you know lightning is about to strike. And if I'm honest, I can't say I was surprised. From the first moment Samantha came into our lives, dressed to perfection, hair shining like it had its own spotlight, I felt a warning bell in my chest. She shook my hand with the limpest grip, eyes already scanning the room for someone more important. I knew right then she would never see me as anything but an obstacle to step over. Eric was too smitten to notice, too eager to prove he could attract a woman like her. I wanted to believe she would soften with time, that marriage would humble her, but deep down I recognized the danger in her smile. So when she finally humiliated me at that dinner, it wasn't a shock. It was the moment I had always known was coming, and I realized I was done pretending not to see it. I think the hardest part for me wasn't even Samantha's cruelty that night. It was admitting that my own son had picked her, and in a way chosen a life where I no longer fit. The birthday invitation hadn't come from Eric himself, not even a quick call to say, "Mom, I'd love you to be there." It arrived in my inbox from his assistant, typed up like a business meeting notice. No warmth, no "we're excited to see you," just the date, the time, the restaurant. There was even a note that said cocktail attire suggested, as if I couldn't be trusted to know how to dress myself. I must have reread that email 3 times, hoping I missed something, some little personal touch, but there was nothing. Still, I went, because no matter how far we drifted, he was my son. That bond doesn't dissolve just because the years get quiet. I arrived early, like I always do, 15 minutes ahead with my nerves tucked neatly under my blouse. I wore the silk top I'd kept wrapped in tissue for years. the one that still carried the faintest trace of the perfume Frank used to love, though the bottle's been empty for over a decade now. My slacks were pressed, my shoes polished, though I caught my reflection in the glass and still wondered if I looked out of place. The hostess glanced at me with polite confusion, scanning the reservation list, clearly unsure where to seat me. I stood there, clutching my small purse, pretending I didn't notice her hesitation, until the doors opened and in swept Eric and Samantha. Eric looked so much like his father in that moment, tall and straight-backed, his jaw set the way Frank's always was when he felt important. For a second, I almost saw my husband again, and it made my heart ache in a way I wasn't prepared for. Samantha floated in beside him, her dress a cream-colored sheath that looked painted on, hair coiled high like she was about to step onto a runway. They were laughing, air-kissing their friends who had already gathered, not noticing me at all. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to see. Either way, I followed them with slow steps, like a ghost trailing a parade that had no place for me. The hostess finally led them to a long table, already crowded with 8 chairs for 9 people. I stood there at the edge, just one step away, waiting for someone, anyone, to say, "Let's make room for Mom." I thought Eric would notice, would pull up another chair the way his father always did, scooting over with a grin. I thought Samantha might offer me the thinnest smile, a nod, a sliver of civility to acknowledge I existed. But no one moved. They went right on laughing, right on clinking glasses as though I wasn't standing there at all. And in that moment, the silence around me felt louder than any insult Samantha could have spoken. Samantha barely lifted her eyes when she noticed me. The way she looked at me reminded me of the way people glance at a homeless person on the corner, quick and dismissive, like my presence was an inconvenience they couldn't be bothered with. Then she turned to the waiter, her voice sharp enough to slice the air, and said, "Excuse me, there's someone hovering at our table. Could you call security?" She looks confused. Just like that, I was dismissed in front of my own son, as if I were a stranger who had wandered in from the cold. The words rolled off her tongue so easily, so confidently, that for a split second I almost believed her, almost questioned if I had a right to stand there at all. The whole dining room froze. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Even the busboys stopped in their tracks. The only sound I heard was the faint clink of glasses from a nearby table and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. My hands began to tremble, not out of fear or even fury, but from something heavier, like the sound of an old foundation beginning to crack under too much pressure. And there was Eric, my own son, sitting inches from me, staring down at his phone screen as if it contained the secrets of the universe. He didn't say a word. He let his wife publicly erase me without lifting a finger. The waiter that night was Danny Lopez, a sweet, soft-spoken kid who had been with us for nearly 2 years. I'd watched him grow into the job, steady and dependable, the kind of young man who sent part of his paycheck home to his mother in Pilsen. His eyes met mine, wide with panic, unsure of what to do. He knew exactly who I was, but I gave him the smallest nod, my lips pressing into the faintest smile as if to say, "It's okay. Go on. Do what she says," and he did. He stepped forward as though he believed I was just another guest in the wrong place, and I let him. I walked out slowly, not giving Samantha the satisfaction of seeing me break, not letting Eric see a single tear. What no one at that table knew, not Eric, not Samantha, not their carefully chosen friends, was that the walls around them were mine. The tablecloths they dined on, I had picked them. The soft gold paint on the walls, I had approved it. Every person serving them had been interviewed, trained, and paid under my watch. 5 years earlier, when Lakeview Trattoria had gone under, I signed the papers and brought it back to life with the money I had scraped together from decades of silent sacrifice after Frank died. I rebuilt it from nothing, brick by brick, tip by tip, hour by hour. And the cruelest irony of all? Samantha Reed, the woman who sneered at me like I was nothing, worked for me. Samantha walked through Lakeview Trattoria like she was born to run it, her heels clicking across the tile as if every sound announced her authority. She whispered orders to servers, corrected hostesses mid-sentence, even poked her nose into the kitchen, tossing out opinions on dishes she couldn't pronounce. The manager, bless his heart, was too charmed by her polished image and sweet talk to push back. He let her play queen because it was easier than confronting her, but I had been around long enough to know the difference between confidence and poison, and what I saw was pure poison in designer heels. I watched the way she treated people when she thought no one important was looking. To Samantha, worth could only be measured in money, in labels, in whether someone's shoes came from Michigan Avenue or the clearance rack at Target. She rolled her eyes at Rachel Turner, our chef, when her accent slipped through. She snapped at Danny if he was half a second late with a refill. She laughed under her breath when Henry spilled water on himself in the rush. To her, they weren't people. They were props. And each time I caught those little moments, it cut into me because I had built this place for the very people she dismissed. That night, after the birthday dinner, I went home to my small apartment and sat in the dark. No TV, no music, just the quiet hum of the fridge and the tick of the wall clock. I let the silence wrap around me like a blanket I had been saving for years, worn but protective. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I sat completely still, my mind replaying every sacrifice I had made to climb back from nothing. I saw my hands scrubbing dishes until my knuckles bled. I felt the ache of standing 12 hours on linoleum floors for wages barely enough to cover rent. I remembered the envelope of crumpled bills I hid under my mattress, growing dollar by dollar until it became enough to buy a dream everyone else thought was impossible. And by morning, the decision was made. I picked up the phone with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. My voice was calm, my instructions simple, my authority unquestioned. By the time the day ended, Samantha Reed's name was no longer listed as assistant manager. Her new position? Dishwashing staff, starting immediately. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a warning. I simply let the paperwork speak for itself. She wouldn't see it coming, but she would feel it. In the steam, in the weight of every greasy pan, in the sting of soap and sweat against skin. And maybe, just maybe, she would finally begin to understand the life she had mocked all along. That night after the birthday dinner, while Samantha probably slipped into satin sheets in some condo high above the city, dreaming she was the undisputed queen of a kingdom she barely deserved, I sat alone at my worn kitchen table. I had on my old flannel robe, the one with a tear in the sleeve, drinking weak tea out of a chipped mug Frank once bought at a flea market. The light above the stove cast long, uneven shadows across the peeling linoleum, and the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't exactly sad, not in the way that makes you cry or crumble. What I felt was heavier, like a stone that had been pressing down for years, the kind of weight that comes from realizing your son has slipped so far away, you can barely recognize the boy you raised. Frank had been gone 15 years by then, and his absence still echoed in every corner of that apartment. He was a good man, my Frank, with hands that smelled of sawdust and big dreams that stretched wider than the Chicago skyline. Together, we built a small construction company from scratch, pouring sweat and trust into every contract. But Frank trusted too easily, signed deals with men who saw his kindness as weakness. And when the market collapsed, everything we had collapsed with it. Within 6 months, the bank took our trucks, our contracts dried up, and the little brick house on the south side where Eric grew up slipped right through our fingers. We tried to hold on. We moved into a smaller rental, then smaller still, each place dimmer and colder than the one before. until eventually it was just me left with nothing more than a battered suitcase, a few pieces of jewelry I swore I'd never sell, and a heart so crowded with memories I didn't know where to put them all. I can still remember the feel of that last set of house keys in my hand, the way the metal pressed into my palm as I dropped them into the landlord's hand, trying not to let my voice shake. Losing a house is one thing, but losing the place where you sang lullabies and celebrated birthdays, that breaks something deeper. Eric didn't see any of it. By then, he was already away at Northwestern on a full scholarship, too far and too busy to notice how bad things had gotten back home. And I let him believe I was fine. I always told him I was fine, even as I scrubbed offices at midnight and stood behind bakery counters with aching feet by morning. I thought I was protecting him from worry, letting him focus on his future. But sitting there that night with my tea going cold and the silence pressing in, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. All those times I told him I was fine, I wasn't. And maybe, in saving him from the truth, I had only taught him to forget who had carried him through the worst years of his life. But I wasn't fine, not even close. I worked nights in downtown Chicago, pushing a vacuum through empty office buildings where the only company was the flicker of fluorescent lights and the echo of my own footsteps. By sunrise, I'd change into my bakery apron and spend mornings behind the counter at a little shop on the corner, my back screaming and my feet swollen before noon. I learned how to stretch $1 until it practically begged for mercy, how to ration groceries so one pot of soup lasted 3 days, how to tell myself no over and over again. No to new shoes, no to birthday gifts, no to turning on the heat when the draft snuck under the windows in January. I told myself it was temporary, that hard work was supposed to be enough in this country, even as I realized the world didn't give a damn about effort if you weren't wearing the right label stitched to your collar. Still, I never let myself give up. I clung to hope with the same stubbornness that had carried me through losing Frank and the house and everything else. Every time someone left a quarter tip in the bakery jar, I pocketed it like it was gold. I kept a spiral-bound notebook hidden under my mattress, recording every cent in careful lines as though writing it down might make the money grow faster. I didn't go out to eat. I didn't travel. I didn't even treat myself to a movie when I desperately wanted to disappear into someone else's story for a few hours. My whole life became one long exercise in waiting, in believing that if I kept saving, if I kept working, something better might finally come. And then one gray afternoon, the kind where the Chicago sky feels like a wet wool blanket pressing down on you, I found myself walking past a little Italian restaurant I'd never noticed before. Its windows were dark, its door chained shut, and taped inside the glass was a handwritten sign, "Closing for good." I stopped right there on the cracked sidewalk, rain misting down and seeping into my shoes, staring at those words as if they were meant for me alone. Something about that place tugged at me. Maybe it was the memory of Frank taking me to an old trattoria for our 10th anniversary, when we were still young enough to believe we were unstoppable. Or maybe it was just the faint smell of garlic and rosemary that still clung to the bricks, as if the building itself wasn't ready to give up. I stood there longer than I should have, ignoring the drizzle running down my collar, letting the ache in my chest grow heavier with every heartbeat. I pressed my hand against the cool glass, and for one impossible moment, I let myself picture it. Lights glowing again, laughter spilling out the door, plates of steaming pasta carried by smiling servers, a place that wasn't just food but family. And instead of walking away, like I had from so many things in my life, I carried that vision home with me. It was the first spark I'd felt in years, and though I didn't know how or when, I knew in my bones I wasn't going to let that little restaurant die without a fight. I couldn't shake that restaurant from my mind. Even back in my apartment, I swore I could still smell the garlic and rosemary drifting in through the window, as if the building itself was calling out, refusing to die. I pulled out that old spiral notebook from under my mattress, flipping through years of cramped handwriting. Every dollar I'd pinched, every tip I'd saved, every sacrifice inked in careful lines. The total wasn't enough, not even close. But something in me refused to close that notebook and surrender. For once in my life, I wasn't going to walk away from something that stirred my soul. So I started knocking on doors, first one bank, then another, then another. Each time I laid out my thin stack of savings, my record of never missing a bill, my reputation as the lady who always paid in cash, always smiled, always showed up. It wasn't impressive on paper, but it was steady. And eventually, that steadiness mattered to someone. A small credit union on the west side agreed to take a chance on me. When I signed the papers, my hands shook so badly I had to steady the pen with both palms. Walking out into the Chicago air that afternoon, clutching the keys to a restaurant I knew almost nothing about, I felt equal parts terrified and alive. That first year nearly broke me. I slept on a cot in the back office more nights than I care to admit, lulled to sleep by the hum of the old refrigerator and the rattle of the pipes. I learned the hard way that fresh basil tastes nothing like dried, that napkins folded into swans impressed people more than expensive wine, that customers don't care about your struggles as long as their plates arrive hot and their glasses stay full. I discovered I could unclog a sink with a butter knife and fix an espresso machine with nothing but a paper clip and a prayer. My back ached, my hands cracked, and my body lived in a constant fog of garlic, grease, and exhaustion. But somehow, with every small victory, the place started to breathe again. The dark windows lit up, the kitchen filled with voices, the dining room hummed with laughter that seemed to patch over every scar the building had carried. I remember one rainy night when a couple lingered over dessert, holding hands across the table, and I thought, yes, this is why. It wasn't about money or status. It was about giving people a space where they could feel at home, even for an hour. And though I had stepped into it blindly, that restaurant had heart, and heart was the one thing I knew how to nurture. When I finally had the keys in my hand, I knew I couldn't run that restaurant alone. I hired carefully, as if I were piecing together a family from scratch. Rachel Turner, a young chef with fire in her bones and hands that moved like music, brought dishes to life that made customers close their eyes and sigh with joy. Henry Price, a dishwasher in his 50s who never learned to read well, could make silverware shine so bright it looked like jewelry. And then there was Angela Brooks, a single mother juggling 2 jobs, who somehow always found a way to crack a joke during the lunch rush, her laugh lifting the whole room. And Danny Lopez, quiet and reliable, with a heart that belonged more to his family than to himself, but who treated every shift as if it mattered. Together, they didn't just work. They breathed life back into Lakeview Trattoria. But through it all, I kept my secret. Not a soul outside those walls knew I was the owner, not even Eric. When he came home from Northwestern, fresh out of college, working at a sleek accounting firm downtown and dressing in suits that cost more than the car I drove, I told him I was just helping out at a local diner. I didn't want him to feel responsible for me, didn't want him to think I was clinging to him for support. And, if I'm honest, I was afraid of something worse, that he simply wouldn't care. It was easier to let him believe I was scraping by in the shadows than to risk finding out my own son felt nothing about what I had built. As the years passed, the distance between us grew. Phone calls dwindled to holidays, visits became rare, and then one day he brought a woman into my life who would change everything. Samantha Reed. At first glance, she seemed perfect. Polished, well-spoken, with a smile that could charm a room before she even sat down. She always knew which fork to use, always said the right thing, never raised her voice, and yet somehow left people around her feeling just a little bit smaller. She complimented my sweater once, her voice sugary sweet, and then tilted her head and asked if it was vintage. as if the idea of me buying something new was laughable. I laughed along, pretending not to notice the glance she gave my worn shoes, or how her nose twitched every time I mentioned working. She saw me as irrelevant, outdated, something to endure until she inherited something better. And what cut deepest wasn't her dismissal. It was Eric's silence. He never defended me, never stepped in to say, "That's my mother you're talking to." He just let it happen, and in that silence, I felt the first real fracture between us. When Samantha first started working at Lakeview Trattoria, I kept myself at a distance. She had just quit some marketing job she claimed was beneath her and waltzed into the restaurant like the world owed her an easier path. She applied for a part-time hostess position, smiling as though she was bestowing us with her presence rather than asking for work. She had no idea I owned the place, no clue that the woman she barely acknowledged at family gatherings was the same woman signing every paycheck. I let her believe it, operating quietly through the manager, keeping my name out of sight, because sometimes silence is the best disguise. It didn't take long for her to start throwing her weight around. Samantha strutted through those doors as if she were doing the staff a favor just by showing up. She whispered unnecessary suggestions to customers, told Rachel how to refine her dishes as though she'd ever boiled pasta herself, and bossed the wait staff with the air of a general commanding an army. The irony was that she had no real authority, but she played the role with such arrogance that people were too weary to fight back. The manager, spineless as he was, let her run wild rather than confront her, charmed by her polished looks and honeyed tone. From the shadows, I saw everything. I reviewed the weekly reports, read every customer note, listened to the staff's complaints whispered in the break room. I saw how she treated Danny, acting as though he was invisible, as though his dedication meant nothing. I watched her roll her eyes when Rachel's accent thickened under stress, pretending not to notice, but making sure others did. And one afternoon, when Henry tripped during the rush and spilled water down his shirt, I caught her laughing behind his back, calling him clumsy. I wrote it all down in my mind, every insult, every gesture, every smirk that revealed the rot beneath her polished surface. I wanted so badly to believe Eric would see it, that he'd recognize who she really was, that he'd step in and say, "Enough." But he didn't. He was too busy climbing his corporate ladder, too blinded by the shine of Samantha's image to notice the cracks forming beneath it. And then came the birthday dinner. They chose Lakeview Trattoria without realizing whose name was etched into the deed, whose sacrifices had brought the place back from the brink. The irony was almost too much to bear. But as painful as it was to watch them parade into the restaurant like royalty, I knew something else deep in my bones. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I want to be clear. I didn't plan revenge that night. I wasn't interested in shouting matches or dramatic scenes. What I wanted was truth, and sometimes that cuts deeper than any form of vengeance, because truth doesn't just sting in the moment, it lingers. It settles in the bones, where you can't shake it off, and Samantha was about to feel every ounce of it. There's a strange kind of poetry in watching someone build their entire world out of illusions, piling on layer after layer, like frosting on a hollow cake, until one day it collapses under its own weight. That's exactly how she carried herself in the weeks after that birthday dinner, as if she was untouchable, as if humiliating me in front of family and staff had erased me completely, as if her manicure and perfume could mask the wreckage she left in her wake. But what she never realized was that the sharpest eyes on her weren't the servers she scolded or the customers she tried so hard to impress. They were mine. I had the vantage point she never expected, not from the dining room, but from the back office tucked behind the wine cellar, where the hum of the fridge mixed with the faint clatter of dishes as I read through the paperwork that told me everything. Every morning before the doors opened, I sipped coffee from a mismatched mug Frank once loved and combed through nightly reports, payroll logs, and customer feedback cards. The words painted a quiet but damning portrait. Samantha snapping at waitstaff, making crude little jokes about busboys, offering pompous critiques of the menu as if she were the second coming of Julia Child when, truthfully, she couldn't boil pasta without burning the water. The manager saw it all too, but he had grown timid, his backbone bent by years of avoiding conflict. He let her run wild, too nervous to risk upsetting Eric, who would occasionally swing by in his tailored suits and drop flowers on Samantha's lap, wrapped in paper that probably cost more than the bottle of Chianti she always demanded. I'd watch from the corner, taking notes in silence. Not because I needed proof for myself, but because I knew one day the truth would have to stand taller than her lies. And as I sat in that dim little office each morning, coffee cooling in my hand, I realized something about power. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, patient, waiting for the right moment. Samantha thought she'd erased me, but she never understood I was the one holding the pen. The staff never came right out and said it, but I could feel the shift, the way frustration seeped into the air like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. Their respect for me stayed intact, but beneath the surface, they were worn down by Samantha's presence. I heard it in the hesitation before they spoke, in the forced laughter after one of her hollow compliments, in the way eyes darted toward each other, when she waltzed into the kitchen wearing heels that had no business being near a stove. Rachel, who had poured her very soul into reinventing our menu and training the new hires, suddenly began asking for fewer shifts. That told me everything. Even Angela, who could find humor in just about any disaster, started to lose her sparkle. Her jokes became fewer, her smile a little more tired. Henry, who usually kept to himself, quietly started taking his lunch breaks outside, too weary to endure Samantha mocking him when he spilled coffee on his apron or stumbled over the mop bucket. These were people who had carried me through the hardest year of my life. People who had turned the restaurant from a hollow shell into a home again. Watching them wilt under her arrogance was like watching the slow unraveling of a sweater I had knitted with my own hands, thread by thread coming apart. Samantha didn't just treat them poorly. She treated the restaurant itself as if it were her personal stage. She strutted across the dining room at peak hours, interrupting servers mid-sentence just to correct them in front of customers, puffing herself up with unsolicited style tips for young hostesses half her age, reminding anyone within earshot that she had a natural eye for leadership, as if she were auditioning for a role that never existed. To a guest walking in off the street, she might have looked confident, capable, even admirable. But to those of us who knew the truth, it was all smoke and mirrors. The irony would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so destructive, because while she was basking in the shallow admiration of customers who didn't know any better, she was blind to the real heart of the restaurant. The strength of Lakeview Trattoria was never in appearances or performances. It was in the grit of people like Rachel and Henry and Angela, people who showed up early, stayed late, and poured themselves into every plate, every glass, every table. Samantha couldn't see that because to her, people were just scenery, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that ignorance caught up with her. The soul of Lakeview Trattoria had never lived in appearances or showmanship. It lived in the people who showed up before dawn to prep vegetables, who stayed until midnight scrubbing the kitchen tiles on their hands and knees, who treated every table like they were welcoming guests into their own homes. That was the heart Samantha could never understand, and still I kept silent. I bit my tongue even when my chest burned to speak. I could have fired the manager for letting her stomp all over his authority, for standing by while she played queen of a castle she hadn't built. But I didn't. I needed the world to see her for what she was, without me saying a word. I needed her mask to crack under the weight of her own arrogance, because when it did, the collapse would be complete. That moment came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of overcast day when the city feels heavy with silence. Danny Lopez came into my office, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the folded slip of paper he carried. His face was pale, his voice trembling as he explained. Samantha had written a note accusing him of stealing tips, demanding he be fired immediately. My stomach turned before I even opened it because I already knew what it was. Not just a lie, but a calculated strike. Danny had been with us nearly 3 years. He was the kid who showed up early for every shift, who never once called in sick, who sent part of every paycheck home to his grandmother in Pilsen so she could keep the lights on. He was steady, reliable, the kind of worker restaurants are built on. I didn't need to investigate. I knew him too well. This accusation wasn't about money, it was about power. Samantha had her eye on sliding one of her cousins into the front desk job, and Danny was just in the way. I told him to take the afternoon off, that I'd handle it. After he left, I sat alone with that note in my hand for what felt like hours. The words written in her polished script dripped with venom, and for the first time, I felt something shift from disappointment into something darker. This wasn't about rudeness or arrogance anymore. It was cruelty, pure and simple, the kind that poisons everything it touches. And I knew then that the silence I had wrapped myself in was over. It was time to act. That night, after the last chair had been flipped and the final register closed, I stayed behind. The restaurant was mine in a way it never was during the day. Quiet, dim, the faint smell of garlic and lemon still lingering in the air. I walked slowly, running my hand along the edge of every table, remembering how many nights I had mopped those floors myself when there was no one else to do it, how my fingers once ached from scrubbing sinks before sunrise, how Frank used to sit with a candle and balance the books when the electricity was cut off. I remembered the ceiling leaks, the wobbly chairs, the endless doubt, and I remembered the stubbornness that carried me through it all. I had rebuilt this place brick by brick, sweat by sweat, silence by silence. And I wasn't about to let a woman like Samantha Reed drag it through the mud simply because no one had ever taught her the meaning of decency. She thought she was above consequence, but she never understood one thing. The higher you build a throne on the backs of others, the harder the fall when those people finally step aside. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. Something inside me had clicked into place, and the decision was final. There would be no screaming match, no dramatic show. Samantha would learn her lesson not in some fiery spectacle, but in something colder, heavier, far more permanent. She would finally know what it meant to be truly unseen, to be stripped of the attention she fed on, to be left with nothing but the weight of her own reflection. By morning, I was ready. The city outside was just waking up, the rumble of early traffic rolling past my window as the smell of fresh coffee filled the back office. I sat at my old wooden desk, the one with the scratches Frank once carved into the corner, and laid out the paperwork I had prepared the night before. It was all neat, precise, and impossible to argue with. A demotion notice with Samantha's name typed cleanly at the top, a revised schedule assigning her to dishwashing duty 5 nights a week, a file of explanations marked under performance and behavior issues. Nothing cruel, nothing embellished, just truth on paper. And as I reviewed every detail, I felt no anger, no gloating, only calm. It didn't feel like the start of a battle. It felt like the end of one. For years, I had swallowed my pride, shielded Eric from hard truths, kept my head down and my heart quiet. But that morning, sitting with my coffee growing cold, I realized I wasn't hiding anymore. The woman who had humiliated me in my own restaurant was finally going to meet the version of me she had never seen. The one who didn't need to raise her voice to make the ground shift beneath her. I sat with my coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the envelope that held her fate. I had planned to leave it on the manager's desk, let the papers do the talking, let the shift schedule speak louder than any confrontation ever could. For a moment, I almost believed it might happen cleanly, quietly, without the need for me to be there. But deep down, I knew better. A woman like Samantha Reed would never let anything end without drama. Pride doesn't go quietly. Pride demands a stage, even when the curtain is falling. So I lingered in that office longer than I should have, pretending to organize vendor invoices, straightening stacks of old receipts, listening as the sounds outside grew sharper. Voices in the hallway rose in pitch, hurried and nervous, and then I heard hers, Samantha's, high, cutting, dripping with vinegar. She was tearing into the front staff about a misplaced reservation card, blaming incompetence, scattering accusations like confetti laced with poison. Her heels struck the tile faster, louder, the sound of someone barreling toward a fight. And in that instant, I knew I wouldn't have the luxury of staying hidden. The door slammed open so hard it rattled the frame. There she was, framed in the doorway, her perfect blowout already wilting in the summer humidity, her eyes red at the edges from rage. In her hand, she clutched a printed copy of the new schedule, the one that stripped her of her little throne and placed her squarely where she belonged, in the dish pit. She came in mid-rant, her words already spilling out like acid, but the second her gaze landed on me, everything stopped. Her voice choked off, her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something real flicker across her face. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. The kind of fear that blooms when you realize the person you've been stepping on has been holding the reins all along. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, until it pressed against her like a weight she couldn't ignore. I watched the way her breathing changed, shallow and uneven. I saw her hand tremble around the paper, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it too tight. For a heartbeat, I thought she might explode, scream, slam the folder onto my desk, unleash all the venom she carried. But then, from the front of the restaurant, came a sharp crash, the sound of a tray of glasses shattering against tile. It rang through the air like a bell, startling her so badly she flinched. And just like that, the moment cracked, the storm paused, and the power in the room shifted for good. The crash of glass out front split the air like an alarm bell, and in that instant, Samantha jumped. She actually startled like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. It snapped her out of whatever rage-fueled trance she'd marched in with. She blinked, her eyes darting toward the sound, then back at me, and suddenly the certainty in her posture faltered. Her grip on the schedule slackened, and I watched her take a half step back. Without another word, she turned on those expensive heels and walked out. The rhythm of her steps different now. Not commanding, not triumphant, but rushed, nervous, almost clumsy. I stayed seated, still as stone, listening as the sharp clicks of her shoes retreated down the hallway, the echo of her pride shrinking with each step. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: relief. But it wasn't the kind of relief that comes from winning. It was deeper, steadier, the relief of knowing I hadn't let her drag me into her mud pit. She had come ready to shatter something, to fight, to claw at me until I gave her the reaction she craved. And I hadn't given it to her. I had sat there calm and quiet, and in that silence, she'd come face to face with a truth she couldn't bend to her will. She wasn't in charge. Not anymore. That afternoon, I walked through the restaurant as if I were seeing it with new eyes. The tension that had hung in the air for months, that invisible smoke of unease, had thinned. The kitchen buzzed with energy again, Rachel moving with her old rhythm, Angela cracking a small joke that drew a laugh from the line cook. Even Henry hummed softly to himself as he polished silverware. The servers looked at each other differently too, more directly, with a spark of confidence that hadn't been there the day before. No one asked me what had happened. They didn't need to. People can always feel when a heavy weight has been lifted, even if they can't name what it was. As I passed by, Danny caught my eye. He didn't say anything either, just gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Gratitude without words, respect without ceremony. I nodded back, and in that simple exchange, I felt something solidify inside me. This wasn't about humiliating Samantha. It wasn't even about reclaiming power. It was about restoring balance to a place I had built with every ounce of myself. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt like the walls of Lakeview Trattoria were breathing easy again. As I made my way through the restaurant that evening, I noticed the small things first. Angela at the hostess stand stood taller, her shoulders less weighed down, her smile no longer forced. Rachel, usually buried in her own head, actually looked up from her prep with a glance that carried more than words ever could. A silent acknowledgement, a quiet thank you. I stayed long after closing, walking slowly between the rows of empty tables, the chairs flipped upside down, the soft hum of the cooler the only sound in the room. I thought about how far this place had come, how far I had come, not just as an owner, not even as a mother, but as a woman who had been dismissed, stepped over, silenced, and still managed to stand tall, even when nobody seemed to notice. And in that silence, I realized I didn't feel bitter. I didn't even feel triumphant. What I felt was calm, steady, and ready. Ready because I knew the next morning would mark a shift that went beyond job titles or schedules. Samantha Reed would walk through those doors, not as a queen presiding over a kingdom, but as another pair of hands expected to do her part. She would learn what it meant to earn a place instead of assuming one. And there was a strange peace in knowing that lesson would be written, not in my words, but in her own sweat. By 8 o'clock sharp the next morning, the kitchen clock had barely finished its first cycle when I saw her slip in through the back entrance, shoulders tight, lips pressed so firmly together they had gone pale, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses she didn't bother to remove. She stood by the service station completely out of place in her black designer blouse and polished leather flats, like she was trying to cling to one last shred of the status she thought she still carried. But it was already gone, slipping from her like cheap perfume after a storm. The staff hardly looked up. To them, she was just another body clocking in. I had set her apron neatly on the shelf, folded like every other apron, with a clipboard of assignments and the checklist for opening procedures. Not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because fairness means everyone starts the same. If she wanted to argue she was being treated differently, she'd have to admit that what she really didn't want was equality. I didn't hover. I didn't gloat. I simply stood at the sink, reviewing inventory lists, my presence filling the room without a single word. Quiet authority has a way of pressing heavier than loud orders ever could, and that morning, the weight of it was undeniable. She didn't say a word to me that morning, but silence has a way of revealing more than speech ever could. I saw the tremor in her hands when she picked up the rag, the way her polished nails scraped awkwardly against the metal as she tried to scrub down the sink. The realization came slowly at first, like fog rolling in, that no one was coming to save her, no one was going to burst in and restore her to the little throne she thought she deserved. She fought to hide it, of course, straightened her posture, forced her face into a mask of neutrality, acted like the steam clouding the air didn't bother her. But I noticed every flicker, every crack. I saw the twitch of her mouth when dishwater spotted her blouse, the way she avoided eye contact when Angela passed carrying 2 trays high above her shoulder, the quick glance toward the door every time it opened as though she expected Eric to appear and pull her out of the mess she had created. By noon, the mask was gone. The steam from the dish pit had dampened her hair so it clung in uneven strands. Her carefully rolled sleeves sagged halfway down her arms, and her leather flats bore water stains that would never come out. She looked nothing like the polished woman who had strutted through that dining room weeks earlier. She looked human. And I couldn't help but remember all the mornings I had done that very same work, wiping counters in the half-light, scrubbing pans until my hands cracked, standing in the silence, with only exhaustion for company. I had done it when grief weighed down my chest, when loneliness pressed against me so hard I could barely breathe, when survival was the only option. Watching her now, standing in the same steam I had lived in for years, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of revenge, no sweetness in seeing her brought low. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, something I hadn't expected. Closure. The kind that doesn't roar or gloat, but settles gently, reminding you that the truth eventually evens the scales all on its own. Samantha had spent years pretending she was untouchable, balancing her pride on the backs of others, mistaking cruelty for strength. And here she was, sleeves rolled uneven, blouse stained, scrubbing the very counters she had once mocked others for cleaning. She thought it was punishment, but I knew better. It was reality, the kind she had spent her whole life refusing to face. And in that moment, I understood I didn't need her apology. The work itself was the lesson, and the lesson was already speaking louder than either of us ever could. The day wasn't finished, not yet. I had something else in mind, something simple but deliberate, a mirror polished bright enough to reflect her vanity back at her. That evening, a small family dinner had been booked in our private dining room, a reservation Eric himself had arranged weeks earlier. He hadn't canceled it after the birthday debacle, hadn't even mentioned it to me, as if assuming I'd stay away to keep the peace. That had been my role for years. To step aside, to swallow my pride, to be the bigger person, but not anymore. This time, I had no intention of hiding. The table was set just as he requested, 12 places, a fixed menu, wine pairings, the works. The only adjustment was one Samantha hadn't anticipated, the shift schedule, which placed her squarely on duty. And in our restaurant, when you're on the clock, you serve. It was almost surreal, watching her step into that dining room with a tray in her hands, carrying out the breadbasket to the very same people who had witnessed her call security on me weeks before. The air felt thick, charged, as though everyone sensed the shift, but no one dared name it. Samantha kept her chin high, trying to hold on to her old composure as she poured wine into crystal glasses, her lips tight, her smile brittle. Jason barely looked up from his phone, tapping at the screen like he was anywhere else but there, too distracted or too unwilling to notice the storm unfolding just inches from his chair. She didn't look at me directly, but I saw everything. The way her knuckles whitened around the tray, the stiffness in her shoulders, the tremor in her hand as she set down plates. Every gesture was mechanical, rehearsed, stripped of the casual cruelty she once used to lord over others. The staff, bless them, didn't smirk or whisper, didn't revel in the irony. They simply worked. They treated her exactly as she had treated them, like part of the background, a uniform filling space, a pair of hands doing a job. That quiet indifference was heavier than any humiliation I could have orchestrated. At one point, she dropped a fork. Just a small slip, a piece of silver clattering against the tile, but the sound rang through the room like a bell, sharp and metallic. Every conversation halted for a breath. Every eye flicked toward her, and for that suspended second, the silence weighed on her more than 100 insults could have. She bent quickly to pick it up, her face flushed, her eyes darting. Not at me, not at Jason, but at the floor, as though if she didn't look up, she could still pretend none of it was happening. And I sat there in the stillness, my hands folded in my lap, letting the truth do its quiet work. The restaurant grew quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. It was as if some heavy fog had finally lifted, leaving behind air that felt easier to breathe. Samantha still came to her shifts, her posture tight, her smile forced, but the sparkle she once wielded like a weapon had dulled. It wasn't the work that dimmed her, not really. It was the absence of control, the sudden loss of the illusion that she was untouchable. She no longer lingered at the hostess stand barking fake orders, no longer hovered over servers to correct them for show. She simply arrived, did what was assigned, and slipped out again, speaking only when necessary. Sometimes I would catch her pausing at the prep station, the stainless steel acting like a mirror. She'd stare for a moment too long, as if she didn't quite recognize the woman looking back at her. That reflection wasn't draped in designer clothes or dripping with diamonds. It didn't command attention. It was just a woman in an apron, sleeves rolled, hair damp from steam, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had finally been made small enough to feel the space around her. And in those moments, I saw her wrestling not with the job, but with herself. But while her arrogance shrank, something else inside me ached deeper. Eric. My son stayed distant. The gap between us stretched wider than ever. He dodged my calls with polite excuses. He canceled the one lunch I tried to schedule, brushing me off as though I were asking for too much. His silence thundered louder than any argument ever could. I had always told myself I would never force him to choose between me and Samantha. But over time, I realized he already had. Not with declarations, but with absence. Each absence carried its own sting. Every holiday where my invitation never came, every gathering where Samantha's hand rested proudly on his arm while mine remained empty, every birthday card that never arrived. I tried to tell myself I could live with that I didn't need his approval to stand tall. But late at night, when the restaurant was closed and the chairs were flipped, I felt that hollow ache settle in again. The ache of knowing the boy I carried, the boy I fought for, had grown into a man who no longer fought for me. A part of me, no matter how small, had always clung to the hope that one day Eric would open his eyes, that he'd see Samantha for who she was, that he'd look at me and finally remember the woman who raised him, who kept the heat on through bitter Chicago winters, who skipped meals so he would never go to bed hungry. I told myself that when the fog of her charm lifted, he'd come back, that blood would matter more than pride. But that fragile hope shattered the morning he walked into the restaurant, unannounced, sharp in a tailored suit, standing in the doorway of my office, like a man I didn't recognize. His face gave nothing away, but I knew, before he even opened his mouth, that he hadn't come to apologize. He laid a set of legal papers neatly on my desk, their weight heavier than any words he could have spoken. His tone was flat, professional, as if he were reciting lines from a script. He reminded me of a clause I had long forgotten, a power of attorney I had signed years earlier when I needed minor surgery and he was still in college. Back then, I trusted him with everything. I thought I was securing peace of mind, not handing over the keys to my future. And in that sterile, lawyerly voice, he told me he was selling the restaurant. The words fell like a hammer. I wouldn't be managing anything anymore. My name erased from the paperwork. In exchange, a payout. A number that was supposed to make me quiet, supposed to measure decades of sacrifice in neat, cold dollars. He said Samantha would help with the transition, as if twisting the knife wasn't enough, as if putting her in charge of dismantling everything I had built was just business. They were moving out of state, he explained, chasing something bigger, brighter. His eyes never softened, not once. It was as though I was just another line item, a deal to be finalized. I sat there staring at those papers, my hands resting against the worn grain of the desk Frank and I had once dreamed over. For years I had scrubbed floors, pinched pennies, fought exhaustion until my body nearly broke, and this restaurant was the proof that I had survived it all. And now my own son, the boy I carried, the boy I sacrificed for, was stripping it away with the stroke of a pen. Not because I had failed him, Not because the restaurant wasn't thriving, but because he no longer saw me. Not as a partner, not as a mother, not even as a person. Just as an obstacle in the way of his next deal. It felt finished, signed, sealed, decided. I sat frozen, the edges of the room blurring like watercolor bleeding into water. I couldn't hear the fridge humming anymore, couldn't even feel the weight of my own hands resting in my lap. All I could see were those crisp legal papers lying on my desk and the man standing over them, not my son, not the boy I once rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers, but a stranger in a tailored suit who had just erased me with a signature. I wondered, with a hollowness I can't put into words, how it was possible to pour everything into someone, to bleed for them, sacrifice for them, and still be the one discarded when the ledger came due. Eric didn't wait for my reaction. He didn't linger, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't even look back. He simply turned and walked out, the echo of his polished shoes fading down the hallway, leaving me in silence with the wreckage. And just like that, what I had built from the ashes of loss and hardship was no longer mine. It hadn't been taken by strangers, which might have been easier to stomach, but by the very people who had humiliated me at my own dinner table. My son and his wife, together. The betrayal clung to me like smoke, thick and suffocating. But life has its own hidden machinery, turning on quiet wheels we don't always see. Sometimes the collapse of everything clears the way for what's been hiding in plain sight. That evening, I sat on the porch, staring out at the streetlights flickering on one by one, my tea untouched beside me, the ache in my chest heavier than anything I'd carried before. My phone buzzed, the restaurant's number flashing across the screen. For a moment, I thought of ignoring it. I didn't think I had the strength left to hear anyone's voice, but something, instinct maybe, made me swipe to answer. It was Danny. His voice was tight, shaking but steady enough to tell me he'd stumbled across something I needed to hear. He had seen the documents Samantha had slipped into the office, and something about them didn't add up. Timestamps that didn't match, signatures that looked doctored, files she had been printing off-site, sneaking them in when no one was watching. He told me money had been missing from petty cash for weeks, and though he'd first brushed it off as a glitch, now he was sure it was deliberate. Samantha wasn't just power-hungry. She was forging, stealing, laying the groundwork for something darker. And suddenly, the edges of my numbness began to sharpen. Danny's call cracked something open, and within hours the picture came into focus. Samantha hadn't just been scheming in plain sight. She had been funneling money through fake invoices for months, maybe longer, and Jason had been blind to it all. I told Danny to send everything directly to my lawyer, and I stayed on the line while he walked me through each piece of evidence. One stolen amount after another, one false vendor name after the next. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined, a web of deception woven into the very walls I had rebuilt. Within 48 hours, my attorney moved swiftly. An injunction was filed, freezing the sale before Jason could push it through. We reactivated my original ownership rights under emergency clauses tied to fraud protection, clauses I had almost forgotten existed, tucked away for situations I never thought I'd face. Every shell invoice, every doctored file was cataloged and sent to the state board, with tax compliance authorities notified before Samantha could slither out from under it. By the end of the week, her name was stripped from everything. She wasn't demoted this time. She was removed. And then came Jason. For the first time in weeks, he called me, not to argue, not to defend her, but to ask one question. How long had I known? My answer was simple. Long enough. I didn't explain further. I didn't owe him explanations for the silence I had kept, the patience I had practiced, the long hours I had spent letting the truth rise on its own. And before he could say more, I hung up, the line going dead like the sound of a door closing softly but firmly. A few days later, he showed up in person, No sharp suit this time, no arrogance in his stride. Just lowered eyes, a man suddenly stripped of the certainty he'd always carried. He said he hadn't known, that he hadn't seen it, that he had trusted her completely. I listened, my hands folded, my face unreadable. But I didn't speak, because sometimes silence carries more weight than words, and in that silence, he had to sit with the truth. That trust isn't something you inherit. It's something you protect. And he had let it slip away. I didn't turn him away out of rage. I didn't lash out or demand apologies. I had simply learned that some wounds don't require stitching. They just need distance and silence to knit themselves closed over time. Jason left that day without pressing for forgiveness, and maybe one day I'll find it in me to offer it. But not yet. Forgiveness has to be honest, and honesty still felt too far away. What mattered was this. The restaurant was mine again, fully, legally, quietly. The papers were clear, the injunction permanent, the title back in my name alone. No loopholes, no signatures waiting to be twisted against me. It was safe, and with it, so was I. The staff knew the truth. Though no one said it aloud, they didn't need to. The air itself felt lighter. The kitchen moved like a song again, steady and seamless, every plate leaving the pass with pride instead of tension. There was no smirking, no gossip, no victory dance, just balance, restored the way it always should have been. And me, I sit at the same battered desk every morning, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the sunlight slant across the restaurant windows in that soft, golden way that makes everything look forgiven. I've come to understand that dignity isn't something handed to you like a gift or granted through approval you have to chase. Dignity is what you claim when you stop asking to be seen and start standing, fully, in the truth of who you are. And after everything, that truth feels like the strongest thing I've ever owned. If this story touched you even a little, don't forget to hit that like button. It means more than you know. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you felt while listening, or if you've ever been through something that made you stronger in the end. And of course, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next story. Your support is what keeps these stories alive, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.